Chapter 22, A Clash of Cultures, 1920 to 1929. These are your core objectives for the chapter. Please make sure that you review them as you're reading the chapter. The 1920s is often referred to as the New Era, or sometimes the Roaring Twenties, or sometimes even the 10-year long party. But what it is it is an era of great change in American society. We have a growing consumer culture that is cultivated by marketing and innovations in marketing, but also by new technologies such as movies and radio. People saw things on the movies, the way people dress, their hairstyles, and they wanted those same types of things. Music, they wanted to listen to the same types of music as everyone else. And so we just begin to see a whole change in our culture. Business is going to be growing and expanding. Sometimes we say that there was a return to normalcy after World War I. People just wanted to forget about the war and move forward, and whether that meant growing their business or changing their lifestyle. We're going to see many innovations during the 1920s. One of the new technologies that's going to grow a great deal during the 1920s is air flight. Of course, the Wright brothers had first experimented with air flight before World War I, and we had began to see the use of airplanes during the war being used as reconnaissance vessels, and then as fighter planes, and then later even as bombers. But after World War I, we began to see airplanes taking on the role of flying goods across the country. They were greatly used to transport the U.S. mail. And two kind of heroes of the age that really made air flight popular, and it took on kind of this iconic role in America, was Charles Lindbergh, of course, who is the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic, and he became just this huge hero in American culture. And then Amelia Earhart, who was also one of the first major female pilots in the country. And of course, she has a tragic end because she tragically disappears when she's trying to make a solo flight around the world. No one really knows exactly what happened to her. But airplanes became to be greatly utilized, and then we're going to see that after they're used to transport goods, that we also begin to see them transporting individuals. Not to the degree of trains yet. That's going to happen after World War II, really. But we do begin to see airplanes being used more for personal use. There are lots of air shows across the country where there's lots of acrobatic flights, and it just becomes very popular. The most significant innovation in travel, however, was not the airplanes, but the automobiles. There had been experimentation with automobiles, obviously, before World War I, and we had used some automobiles, like trucks, to a limited degree during World War I. But after World War I, we began to see this massive production of automobiles. And of course, Henry Ford is one of the first individuals that we could credit with this new, what we would call, car culture. Because when he created the Model T, it made automobiles accessible to more people across the country. Before, only wealthy individuals could really afford automobiles. And so you had a very limited use of automobiles on a personal level. Once more and more people began to be able to purchase those Model Ts, and then other car companies jump into the mix, we see that it really changes American society. If you have cars, that leads to other industries such as highway building, and then you're going to also need fueling stations, and so you're going to need more gas stations around the country, and you're going to need rubber for the tires, and then if people are traveling, they're going to need to stop and get something to eat or stop and sleep. And so the whole car culture led to a lot of new industries and a lot of new businesses growing up in American society. Really, it changes American society. The people have this new freedom. Before cars, people rarely moved away from their homes or even visited relatives that often. Now you have this freedom. You can get in your car and you can drive to town, or you can get in your car and you can drive over to the next city to go shopping or go visit a friend or a relative. And so America becomes much more independent, not tied so much to our home place, our birthplaces, and it really begins to just emerge that we are a more free society, and then that's going to influence other things like us being more open to different types of changes in society, like women voting and women having more rights outside of the home. New movies and new types of literature. So the car culture greatly changes American society. One of the new pastimes that really comes into place in the 1920s is movies. Americans become just really enamored with movies. Of course, first they started with the silent movies, but after you moved into the talkies, great Hollywood icons began to develop, like Charlie Chaplin. And Americans really would spend, many hours as often as they could going to the movies. And this became just America's pastime, going to the movies. As American culture began to change, we also began to see that change reflected in our music. The 1920s music that is very identifiable with the age is jazz music. This is really known as the birth of jazz. Really, jazz had been going on in the southern communities, especially in Louisiana, for years before this, but it takes on a nationwide audience beginning in the 1920s. One of the most famous jazz musicians is Duke Ellington during this time period. Jazz also really broke the color barriers because many of these early jazz musicians were African Americans, but Americans from all races would flock to the jazz clubs to hear this new form of music and to dance to the jazz music. Another way that we see the culture being reflected in our society is through our literature. F. Scott Fitzgerald is one of the most famous literary figures of this time period, and he wrote books like The Great Gatsby about this time period, writing about the boisterous spirit of the age and the decadence in many ways of the age that we lived in. The 1920s is also a time when we began to see African Americans being able to break out, as it would, in the arts and sciences and literature. They began to have more freedoms than they had had previously. And one of the artistic movements that we greatly identify with this liberation of African Americans is the Harlem Renaissance. One of the most famous figures, and really a leading figure of the Harlem Renaissance, was Langston Hughes. He was a poet and a playwright, and his poetry became very famous during this time. But he also was a social activist. He really began to push for African Americans to be able to exercise their rights to vote and to move away from segregation. Another famous figure of this period was Augusta Savage. She was an African American female sculptor, and she was also an educator, and she began to spread the message about African Americans becoming more educated and moving up in society from education. The Harlem Renaissance, of course, occurs across the country, but we give it the term the Harlem Renaissance because much of this art, music, poetry, literature is centered in Harlem, in New York. This was an area where African Americans had more freedoms, they had more rights to vote, and so we began to see that many of these artistic figures flocked to Harlem. But the Harlem Renaissance is going to permeate society, and it helps lift up African Americans in these early years, giving them the idea that we can achieve our true freedoms that were fought for in Reconstruction and Civil War. An interesting figure of this new age of African Americans was Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey becomes synonymous with what was called Garveyism, which was basically the concept that in order to protect African American cultures, African Americans should actually completely separate from white culture. He created the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and this association really advocated for relocation of African Americans, or recolonization, for African Americans to build a colony of their own in Africa, move completely out of the United States and create their own country, their own colony in Africa. The 1920s also brings us new developments in science. Einstein, of course, is one of the figures that develops during this time period. Albert Einstein is synonymous with the theory of relativity, excuse me, and he is known as the father of modern physics. Of course, without Einstein, we never would have been able to crack the atom and bring ourselves into the atomic age later in the 20th century. Einstein also was a Nobel Peace Prize awardee, winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1921. The 1920s is an interesting age because at the time that we have all of this great progress being made in airplanes and cars, innovations in music, the movies, literature, all of these great innovations, and we have this great post-war prosperity that's going on. American business is growing faster than ever before, and it's in the words of the president, Calvin Coolidge, who is greatly identified with the 1920s, the business of America is business, where we emerge as the strongest economic and military power in the world after World War I. So we have all this great prosperity that is going on in the country. But at the same time, we're going to see it is a period of great intolerance. Americans really wanted to return to what they called the period of normalcy. We wanted to turn inward. We wanted to go back to isolationism. We were disenchanted with our involvement with the rest of the world because of the brutality of World War I, and we don't want that to become the norm for us, getting involved in other countries' foreign policies. And so we also begin to see this fear of things that are different. We talked earlier in a previous chapter about the first Red Scare, this fear of communism that began to take over the country. We also began to see a revival of the Ku Klux Klan, which had been on the decline in our country since the late 1880s. But the Klan will come about in a new form, and actually forms in the North during the 1920s, and it becomes much larger, much more widespread. It becomes, unfortunately, a national organization, not just a Southern organization, and it becomes more comprehensive in its hate. The Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s disliked any, if you were black, if you were an immigrant, if you were a Catholic, if you were Jewish, if you were Hispanic, basically if you were not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the Klan did not like you and did not want you to be in America. We also see that there's some pictures here on the slide you can see. They had these huge Klan parades, and people would come out to see them, and they have a very large following in a lot of the rural areas across the country, and even in some of the cities across the country. One of the pictures, if you look at the lower picture, it is a Klan meeting, and it almost really reminds you of church. The Klan co-opted some of our religious figures like the cross and used them in a non-Christian form. But they had these huge meetings, and their popularity grew immensely during this time period. We also, though, do see some defects in the prosperity during this time period. One of the biggest defects that we have in the prosperity of the 1920s is the fact that this rapid industrialization, this rapid economic growth is all in the cities. It's urban, it is not rural. And we do begin to see by the 1920s that farmers are beginning to have some difficult times. Prices for farm products are decreasing at drastic rates, and that makes it hard for farmers to make a living, which anytime we have weak agriculture in American society, it does indicate that there are some weaknesses in our economic structure, and that eventually that's going to collapse. Something is going to happen. We'll, of course, see by the end of the 1920s that's going to occur with the great stock market crash in 1929, leading us into the Depression. In the more recent past, we had a similar situation in the 1980s, and then we had a very weak agricultural system where many farmers were losing their lands because of high cost of credit and low prices for their goods. And then in 1988, we had another huge stock market crash. So agriculture is a major part of American economic growth and health. And so we always need to be wary of when there are defects in our agricultural elements in our society. Also, this wild, unregulated business expansion, it leads to corruption in business. There is no government regulation of business. There's no government regulation of the stock market. And so we begin to see a lot of abuses of the system. And so we see that that's going to be a major factor. Another big defect in the prosperity that really is an offshoot of World War I is that banking is undercapitalized. The banks are really lending out more money than they should, more money than they could afford to, not only to American businesses and American citizens, but also to foreign countries. And so eventually all these defects are going to come to a head and lead us to that Great Depression of the 1930s. Another social experiment that occurred during the 1920s was Prohibition. There had long time been in American society the temperance leagues, and they gained a lot of leverage during World War I. And that, of course, leads us eventually into the passage of the 18th Amendment, which will go into effect in 1920. The 18th Amendment made the sale, distribution, production, and consumption of alcohol illegal. Where many states had done this on a local level before, now this is nationwide, and it's part of the Constitution. It's not just a federal act. The Volstead Act was the act put in place to enforce prohibition. And we see that the age of prohibition is one that is controversial, because some people say that alcohol consumption actually increased because once you make something illegal, more people want to experiment with it. Others will say that alcohol consumption actually did decrease during Prohibition. What we do know is whether it increased slightly or decreased slightly, there wasn't a huge change in the consumption of alcohol. But it did lead to some very negative things in American society, like organized crime, because individuals that did want alcohol were going to get it. And So it led to, people like Al Capone developing crime families where they could get alcohol to others who wanted it. It also led to the unregulated production of alcohol, this bathtub gin and other types of alcohol that were created without any type of safety precautions that sometimes made people sick, blinded them, or even killed them because of the effects of the alcohol. It was very difficult to enforce something of this widespread nature, and you can make, moonshine out, with some grain and make that out in the back, the backyard, or you can make the bathtub gin. And so it was really difficult to enforce. That led to a great deal of corruption of American institutions. Sometimes maybe we overly look at that and say that all of the police forces in Chicago and places like that were corrupt. They were taking bribes from Al Capone and those individuals. But we do see that there was some elements of some corruption in that. And because of a lot of the violence and the organized crime that came from Prohibition, by 1933, we're in the middle of the Great Depression, and FDR decided that it would be time to end Prohibition, and so Congress will push out the 21st Amendment to the American public, and the 21st Amendment will basically just repeal the 18th Amendment. It says that the 18th Amendment is no longer in effect. Of course, one of the things that does, once you repeal Prohibition, you can then go ahead and begin the legal production of alcohol again. And so the government can put the excise taxes back into effect, and that can help fund the government during the Depression. So it wasn't just a cultural reason for ending Prohibition, or even because of the crime and violence that started. There were also some economic reasons to end Prohibition. Another amendment that was passed during this time, of course, that we've talked about previously, was the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Finally, after all of those years of pushing and working for it since before the Civil War, but especially during Reconstruction and all the way to the 1920s, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote in America. Partially due to the post-war hysteria and this fear of all things different, America began to initiate some of our most widespread immigration reforms that we had ever had in the country. Before the immigration restrictions of the 1920s, America had pretty much been an open door policy, which meant if you could get to America, if you had the money to get here, you could come in. There were no quotas, there were no screenings really set up to keep you out of the United States. That, of course, changed a little bit in the 1880s when we began to restrict Chinese immigration, but that was only limited to Chinese being eliminated from immigrating. But by the 1920s, we see that many Americans want to limit more immigration. They really want to keep foreign ideals out of America. And so our first really sweeping Immigration Act in America was the Emergency Quota Act of 1924. The Emergency Quota Act set up a quota system, and what that basically means is that it set up a certain percentage of people that could come in based on nationalities, based on where you're coming from. So it set a total limit of 350,000, and 350,000 is the max. Even if you're, say you're from Poland, and they said that 2% of the people living in the United States of Polish descent in 1910 could come to America. But if that 350,000 had been met, then that whole 2% would not get to come. I know that's a little confusing, but it has to do with the total number, but it also has to do with what country you're immigrating from. based on the 1910 census. That was in place for several years, but then about 3 years later, we're going to get another act, the National Origins Act, which reduced the total number of immigrants even more, reduced the number to 150,000, and moved the base year for the quota back to 1890. What we're doing when we move that base year back to 1890 is restricting more of what was considered the undesirable immigrants, restricting more of the immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. It would allow more immigrants to come in from Western European countries like Great Britain and Germany and France, but individuals coming in from Poland and Russia and Italy and Greece would have fewer numbers that could come in. Because those were the areas where we were fearful of those foreign ideas, different religions, different political views. They want to keep those out. We also see during this period of post-war adjustment the influence of big business on government tariff policies. Tariffs, of course, are import taxes. And so we began to see higher import taxes on goods coming in from foreign countries. The Ford-Macomber tariff, which was passed in 1922, placed really high taxes on all foreign goods coming into America. As I said, the goal of this is to get Americans to buy American goods, which enriches American businesses. In 1930, we see an even higher increase in the tariff with the Hawley-Smoot tariff. The Hawley-Smoot tariff placed the highest import taxes on foreign goods ever in American history up to that point. The irony of the Hawley-Smoot tariff is it was passed soon after the Great Depression started in America, and it was actually passed as a measure to try to alleviate the Depression, but it actually made the Depression worse, because one of the things that we always have to look at with tariffs is that when we increase import duties on goods coming into the United States, then our tariff partners or our trading partners are going to increase tariffs on American goods coming into their countries. So while we are limiting foreign goods coming in, our trading partners are going to start limiting American goods going into their countries. So you have to keep a balance. If you get the tariffs too high, it can actually have a negative impact on business rather than a positive impact. The Hawley-Smoot tariff did that. It had a negative impact on the economy rather than the positive impact they were hoping for. In foreign affairs, the United States has two big concerns. The first being the war debts from World War I. During World War I, the United States had really become the financial backer of the Allies. And by the time we get out of the war, our allies in World War I owed us about $10 billion from those loans. Great Britain and France owed the most money, and they really wanted the United States to just forget about those loans, just to forgive those loans. But we could not. Our banks had a stake in that, and they have to get the money back. The problem in collecting the debts after World War I is that the economies of Great Britain and France and other European countries were just totally disrupted by the war, and they were having a great deal of problems getting back on track. When we look at our Great Depression starting at the end of 1929, beginning of 1930, Italy, for example, went into a Great Depression in 1921. So the Depression started in Europe really soon after the war. And so these countries really could not pay the money that they owed us. While he was still in office, President Wilson encouraged Congress to lower the tariff because he said that that could stimulate trade for our European allies, which would allow them to pay the war debts off. But there was so much business influence in Congress at this time, those tariffs were never lowered, and those countries could not pay their debts. What we began to see happening regarding the war debts is that Great Britain and France began to tie the war debts to the war reparations, saying that they could not pay us our war debts until Germany paid them the war reparations. If you'll remember, when we were looking at World War I, Germany had to pay a great deal of war reparations to the Western Allies because they lost the war. So they said, when Germany pays us, we'll pay you. Well, that wasn't good enough for Americans. Our banks are weakened greatly because of the lack of these debts being paid. So in the early 1920s, Congress comes up with a plan known as the Dawes Plan. The Dawes Plan provided for America loaning money to Germany, and then Germany could use that money to pay war reparations to Great Britain and France, and then Great Britain and France could use that money to pay American banks our war debts. So it's really kind of a convoluted system if you think about it. It's just a cycle of money. American money is going to Germany. That same American money is going from Germany to Britain and France, and then that same American money is coming back. The idea really of the Dawes Plan was that we're gambling, or we're betting that the German economy will recover. The Germans have traditionally been able to have a strong economy and a strong military. Unfortunately, because of a lot of the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, that's not going to happen in Germany after World War I. And so we're going to be misplaced there with our trust that the German economy will grow. We're saying that we're going to replace all these debtors, Great Britain, France, Italy, all of these people, with just Germany, and Germany will be able to repay the debt. As I just said, the Dawes Plan doesn't really work because the German economy never really gets back on a good footing because of the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. Another problem, of course, comes in once we have the great stock market crash in 1929. American banks can no longer loan Germany money, and so that, throws the whole cycle out of whack. In 1930, President Hoover will declare a one-year moratorium on the war debts. That just means for a year we won't expect our Western allies to pay us. The idea is hoping that giving them a year, they can get themselves together, and then they'll be able to pay. No one realized how long the Great Depression was going to last, that it was actually going to be a decade-long depression here in the United States and in Europe. And so that one-year moratorium really was just kind of a drop in the bucket. It's interesting when we talk about the war debts from World War I, only one of the European countries that owed us money from World War I actually ever paid us the full amount that they owed, and that was Finland, little bitty Finland. It took them quite a while. They didn't pay off the World War I debt till 1976, but they did finally get it paid off. The rest of the countries, Great Britain and France, never really paid off all of that money. And of course, that leaves our banks in a weakened position, and that's one of the reasons that when the stock market crashes in 29, many of our banks will also collapse. Another area of foreign affairs that the United States is interested in this post-war period is arms regulation. And even though the United States did not join the League of Nations, we are still very interested in what we called unilateral arms reduction. Remember, that had been one of the 14 points. Arms reduction at this time really was focused on the navies. The navies were the big arsenals for the countries. And so in 1921, the U.S. will sponsor the Washington Naval Conference, and will bring together most of the European powers and Japan to this conference with discussions about how can we limit the size of our navies so that they're not so threatening to each other. The Washington Naval Conference will culminate in what is known as the Five Powers Naval Treaty. And in the Five Powers Naval Treaty, we will establish a ratio of how large the navies can be for the 5 powers that attended. And that ratio is 5, 5, 3, 1.67, 1.67. Now, what that means in terminology that we civilians can understand is that the United States and Great Britain can have the largest navies. They get 500,000 tonnage of battleships in their navies. So if you can, it doesn't matter how many ships, it matters how big the ships. So once you hit that 500,000 tonnage, whether you did that with 1 ship or 3 ships, if you had 3 smaller battleships, that's how big your battleship navy could be. Japan could have 300,000 tonnage of battleships, and then France and Italy could have 175,000 tonnage of battleships. They used a similar ratio for aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers were not considered as important in 1921. Later, of course, we'll see that they will supplant the battleship as the premier vessel of the navies, but in 1921 the battleships are still the big boys of the Navy, and so the 5 Powers Naval Conference did begin to limit the size of the navies. Now, one of the negatives that comes out of this conference, though, is Japan was really insulted that they were forced to take a smaller amount than Great Britain and the United States. They felt that their position in the Pacific was equal to the U.S. and Britain's position in the Atlantic, and they should get to have a larger navy. But in order to get them to take this smaller size navy, the U.S. and Great Britain made a promise that we would not fortify any of our possessions in the Far East. So from 1921 until the outbreak of World War II, the United States and Great Britain did not build up our fortifications of any of our possessions in the Pacific or the Far East, like the Philippines, Guam, those areas. And of course, looking backwards in history, which I always tell you not to do, but we see that that was not a good plan, right? Because that's one of the reasons that all of those little islands fell so easily to the Japanese, beginning in the late 1930s, when the Japanese became very aggressive. Another thing that we see occurring in regard to foreign policy is this idea that maybe we can outlaw war. And in 1928, the United States and France proposed the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The Kellogg-Briand Pact basically said that war was outlawed as a policy for nations. And we hope that we could get many other countries to sign this. Great Britain and France were the first to sign the Kellogg-Briand Pact, saying that we would reject war as a means of settling our foreign policy issues. All in all, about 62 countries ended up signing the Kellogg-Briand Pact, outlawing war for their countries. Of course, this is 1928. In only 11 years, we're going to see Germany, who also signed the pact, is going to violate the pact by invading Poland. And even before that, Italy, who also signed the pact, will violate the pact by invading Ethiopia. So the Kellogg-Briand Pact outlaws war, but it was really just giving lip service to this concept. And one of the real negatives is that it gave a false sense of security to Americans, that now that war is illegal, people won't do it, because we're still a little bit naive about foreign policy in the 1920s. In 1928, we have a presidential election year, and as it become the tradition, not the law, but the tradition, Coolidge will step aside and he won't run for re-election. But everything's going so great that everyone loves the Republicans. And so it's pretty much decided, going to probably be a Republican candidate for the presidency. Herbert Hoover will run as the Republican candidate. He will run against Al Smith, who was the Democratic candidate. Al Smith was the first Roman Catholic to run for the president in America. And he gets a lot of negative publicity for that because of many of the misconceptions about the Catholic faith in our country during this time period. He was also referred to as Alcohol Smith because he spoke out against prohibition. He said prohibition had been a failure and that we should eliminate prohibition. And so one of the negative nicknames that he got was Alcohol Smith. Another thing that Al Smith stated in the 1928 election was that the American economy was teetering on the brink of collapse, that there were defects in our prosperity and we needed to fix those defects in our economic system. And if we did not fix those defects, then there was going to be a horrible catastrophe. And of course, everyone laughed at him because the country's growing and expanding and it's the roaring 20s and everybody's making money. And they were like, what is this guy, saying? He's crazy. Herbert Hoover, on the other hand, was considered kind of the wonder boy. He was a self-made millionaire. He had led the Food Administration during World War I and had done a great job with that. He had also led the American Red Cross during the great 1927 Mississippi River flood that had flooded huge areas of America. And so he was considered to be, the perfect man for the job. He's a businessman. He's had, this national and international recognition. When he spoke about prohibition, Hoover said it was a noble experiment. So you can kind of take that. He's a pretty good politician with that. You don't know if he's saying he's for it or against it. He just said it's a noble experiment. And regarding the economy, he basically promised that we would eliminate poverty in America within the next 4 years. Well, of course, unfortunately, that's not going to happen. But Hoover will win the election. He will win it very easily. But then, of course, he's going to have one of the most tragic presidencies because the Great Depression will hit about a year after his election. This concludes the PowerPoint for Chapter 22. Our next one will be Chapter 23, the Great Depression.